Howdy and welcome to the Strange West Podcast. This is your host and word hustler extraordinaire, Trent Tano. Leading us in, as always, with their rendition of Eno Morricone's For a Few Dollars More is the mighty Mitch Polzak and the Royal Deuces. If you like your Western guitar with a hint of spaghetti, then head on over to MitchPolzak.com. That's Mitch, Polzak.com. And we continue our Cowboy Vs Nazi adventures with Chapter 5 of Paris High Noon. Get your copy today at ParisHighNoon.com. Both paperback and ebook available at ParisHighNoon.com. T-shirts are also available at Society6.com/Trentano. Both Paris High Noon and the Mustache T-shirts are available at Society6.com/Trentano. And before we start, a big thank you to James K. Doyle for lending us his time and talent to the Strange West podcast. Rumor has it that he has yet to listen to the podcast, and I highly encourage him to please do. He really brings Paris High Noon to life. And without further ado, here is Chapter 5 of Paris High
Noon. Chapter 5, The Trail Out of Town. The ambulance ran out of gas just past Chartres. The seat of the prefect of Eure-et-Loir was a ghost town filled with nothing but wind and rats. They ditched the ride in an abandoned barn. No one saw them hotwire the ambulance or bothered to look at their papers at the checkpoints, let alone stop them. The soldiers were content to smoke cigarettes, drink plundered coffee, and dream of their homes on the other side of the Rhine. Dawn was on the horizon, and Catfish, Jean, and Saint Jude found themselves on foot in occupied territory, wanted by the Wehrmacht. Once the sun came up, they would have a tough time getting through the Norman countryside, which was dominated by small farming hamlets and villages spread across the lush green hills and wide river valleys. They had enough provisions to last a few days, but after that it would be hard hunting. Jean had been appointed pack mule and complained about the weight until the old cowboy reminded him that the lighter it got, the emptier his belly was going to be. Planes roared high above. The bombers were flying in a tight formation like a flock of metal crows in the growing light of dawn. Jean jumped under the nearest tree and put his arms over his head. "They have called out the Luftwaffe to bomb us." St. Jude laughed. "Idiot. They're headed for England to bomb Churchill and the rest of those fools." "Whether they're after Churchill or us, we better get moving," Catfish said. He took off his beret and grabbed his cowboy hat from the harvest sack. He swept back his silvery curls and pulled the brim down snug over his brow. They marched alongside the road. Once, a pair of headlights flashed behind them and they dove into a ditch. Catfish and St. Jude both had their guns ready, but the truck passed them by. Again, Jean wished he had a gun. He thought maybe he should have kept the rifle used to shoot the sergeant, although there was no way he could sneak around Paris with it. Knowing what he knew now, he would have taken the officer's Luger. If he got a chance at a gun again, Jean would take it. They crept along the dirt road as the sun broke over the horizon, like rabbits on the run. Catfish pulled them off into the thick green bramble and briar of the bocage hedgerows. Jean had a tough time breaking through, tearing his shirt and pants on branches and thorns. On the other side, they stopped to rest and grab a little breakfast of bread, dry salami, cheese, and wine. "Well, it ain't sow belly and black coffee, but it'll do," Catfish said. He took out his silver flask of Kentucky bourbon for a touch of the brown, which cut the morning film and left a pleasant tone on his tongue. "I thought it was buffalo you cowboys ate," St. Jude said. He gulped down the wine freely and ate more than his share of the food. Jean was a bit put off by his brother's greedy appetite. They would have to ration what food they had. Besides, he thought they should give a bigger share to Catfish. He was the one they were relying on to save their backsides. "Oh, you're thinking of the Indians," Catfish said. Jean let out a yawn. "Did you ever sleep in a teepee?" The thought came to him because the wine had made him sleepy, and the idea of sleeping outside scared him from the simple reason he'd never done it before. "Yep, slept in one for close to 2 years. That was made out of buffalo, too. Everything the Sioux had was made out of buffalo." Catfish noticed Jean nodding off and threw a rock near his head. "Wake up. Ain't no time to be sawing logs with the Boche on our trail." "But how far can we go?" Jean said. It seemed to him if they moved much farther, they would hit the channel and have to swim to England. "We go until the going's done. Hell, try that whining of yours on the outlaw trail and you'll find a bullet resting in you." Jean was too tired to take the threat seriously, but got up anyhow. The sun was up. The fresh morning burned away. There were no clouds in the sky, only a slight breeze carrying a hint of the ocean that cooled their brows from time to time. Catfish had dealt with heat before, from the high waterless plains to the blast furnaces of the Sonora Desert. It was this part of being an outlaw he didn't miss: the heat, exhaustion, little food, and bad water. For his part, Catfish didn't look forward to walking all over Normandy with the Colt 45 strapped to his leg. His gun rig wasn't designed for a man going out for a long stroll. Again, he wished he'd brought the Winchester. But he wasn't thinking when he walked out of the hotel. At that moment, he only felt a strong wound to his pride. This was supposed to be his retirement, and now the Nazis had ruined it for him. A wrong like that could not be borne for long. Jean and Saint Jude weren't as worse for wear as the old cowboy, but each suffered in his way. Jean kept sweating until his shirt and underpants were drenched. They chafed under his armpits and his crotch until he had to walk a little bow-legged. Saint Jude sweated out all the wine until his mouth was parched and his stamina shaky. He took off his big suit jacket and rolled up the legs of his pants to his knees. They huffed and puffed their way until they reached the edge of an apple orchard. The fruit was starting to redden, so Jean stuffed as many as he could in the harvest pack. Catfish spotted a bombed-out cottage at the edge of the orchard. The only thing in decent shape was the barn. It wasn't much, but it was some place to hole up until nightfall. Catfish led the way towards the edge of the field, where he told them to lay low. Jean flopped his belly to the ground and immediately fell asleep. Saint Jude looked at his brother, whose stomach growled while he dreamed gingerbread dreams. Jean was useless. If he had really killed a soldier, Saint Jude figured it for a fluke. When their father would beat them, Jude stood his ground. But Jean was never one to stand up. He didn't let the fact that Jean was only 4 deter him from feeling that his little brother was weak. He figured that weakness could compromise both him and their guardian cowboy. St. Jude wondered what a skilled gunfighter and bandit saw in Jean. It irked him to no end that Jean was getting the attention while a seasoned outlaw such as St. Jude was perceived as a hanger-on who didn't know his brains from his bowels. He thought about striking out on his own, but St. Jude knew he wouldn't last long. The world had changed, and he wasn't smart or clever enough to change with it. For now, pride had to take a back seat to practicality. As the minutes trudged by, St. Jude wondered what the old cowboy was looking at. Finally, he spoke up. "You falling in love with that barn or what?" "Stay quiet and still," Catfish said. Catfish trained his senses on the barn. He wanted to get to know the smells and sounds around it in the farmhouse before going in. Tuning into the landscape was a trick he learned when he was with the Sioux. The land had a way of warning you if things were out of place. Catfish shook Jean. "Go and check out the farmhouse," he said, "but stay clear of the barn for now." Jean thought he was still dreaming when the order was given. "But I don't have a gun," he said. "What if the Boche come?" If they come, you'll wish you didn't have one, Catfish said. They'll probably think you're some lost kid. If they find shooting iron on you, then they'll string you up. There are plenty of trees around. Don't worry, little brother, Saint Jude said, pulling out his automatic. We'll come get you if the Boche come. Saved by the cavalry. That's the way it goes, right, Catfish? Saint Jude was starting to strain the old cowboy's patience. No cavalry Catfish ever saw could make 20 miles without being late for the last 15. He motioned to Jean, and the boy walked out of the orchard towards the ruined farmhouse. Jean felt Catfish's eyes on him, and he wanted to make sure he did everything the cowboy way, even though he didn't exactly know what that was. To the Gars, everything the Catfish did seemed right, and everything he did was wrong. He didn't mind being corrected. He just didn't want to disappoint. Jean reached the bombed-out cottage and didn't see anything of value, just broken glass and shattered furniture. He hoped whoever lived in the cottage wasn't around when the bomb fell. While Jean pondered the notion, Catfish got up and started to walk back into the apple orchard. "Where are you going?" Saint Jude asked. He was seized by the sudden fear the old cowboy might leave them. "Stay put and watch out for your brother. We ain't alone on this here farm." Catfish walked back 50 feet into the orchard and then dog-legged into the left side of the barn. He had seen what he felt when he reached the edge of the farm. Someone had moved up in the hay loft when Jean went for the house. It probably wasn't a German, more likely a fugitive like themselves. But after the skunk incident, he wasn't going to bank on a happy-go-lucky vagabond. Catfish made it to the barn's back door, which hung open. There were no horses or livestock, just vermin. He stalked under the hayloft, his boots treading softly on the hay. He picked up a pitchfork lying against a broken water barrel. Up above him, through the boards of the loft, someone moved. Catfish homed in on the movement and sent a quick jab of the rusty metal prongs through the slats. There was a loud yelp and the scurrying of 2 feet. The unlucky man jumped up and ran till the boards ran out, then fell freely until the ground made him pay with a thud. Catfish pulled his pistol and covered the man, who was out cold. Jean ran into the barn, followed by Saint Jude. "Well, if you don't believe in God, I guess you can believe in fallen angels," Catfish said, as he stooped over to have a better look at the young man. Stalks of red hair crept out from his ragged beret. His uniform was dirty and torn. Saint Jude went through the prostrated man's pockets, but only found a handkerchief with a chunk of smelly cheese wrapped inside. Jean looked around the barn and noticed the French service revolver on the ground. Before he could make a grab for the gun, Catfish had picked up the pistol. "You'll get one soon enough," he said. The young man started to come to. The first thing he saw through his blurred vision was Catfish standing over him with a big gun in one hand and his own revolver in the other. The man's face, which was sprinkled in a buckshot of light freckles, went pale, and he threw up his hands. "I surrender," he said in a startled voice. "Ha!" Saint Jude laughed. "Just like a French soldier." Catfish put both guns away and helped the man to his feet. "No need to surrender to us, son. But if you stick around with us long enough, you might not get a chance to." The red-headed stranger, still unable to understand just who was standing in front of him, took off his beret and clutched it to his chest. "Please, monsieur, don't kill me." "It's okay, we're not going to kill you or haul you off to jail," Catfish said. "We're on the same trail, pard." As the stranger dusted himself off, Jean offered him a drink from the last bottle of wine. He gladly accepted. "Hey, not so much," Saint Jude complained. "You think this guy is somebody?" Catfish let Saint Jude's comments float over. He was interested in the young stranger's story, as it could help them avoid the Wehrmacht. "My name is Patrice Fournier," the man said. "Nice to meet you, Pat," Catfish said. "My name is Catfish. And this is Jean and Saint Jude. Don't let the tough names fool you. We're a soft bunch." Patrice smiled and said hello and held out his hand. Jean smiled back, and the two shook like one trail hand to another. Saint Jude just smirked and kept his hand in his pocket. "Another runaway soldier. Thanks for defending France, you louse." Patrice's eyes dropped. Jean shook his head at Saint Jude. As the younger Malheur, he had taken his fair share of his brother's barbs. He was used to it. But it was a bad way to greet a stranger. Patrice sat down on a bale of hay and took another swig from the wine bottle. "Just before the war started, I was drafted in and sent to the Belgian lines," he said. "Everyone thought the Boche wouldn't come through the Ardennes, but they did. They came at us like a nightmare with their demon panzers blowing us all to hell. I don't have to tell you the rest of the story, mes amis. It was every man for himself. By the time I reached the rear, a Stuka raid had bombed what was left of my outfit. They were all dead, or wishing they were. I dropped my rifle, took a dead officer's pistol, and kept running. I've been running ever since." Patrice took another swig. The alcohol warmed his body and relaxed him a bit. "What outfit were you boys in?" he asked. "What makes you think we're soldiers?" St. Jude said. "I wouldn't soldier for 1,000,000 francs. "If you're not runaway soldiers, then what are you?" "Outlaws," Catfish said. "Men wanted by the Nazis, just like yourself, but for different reasons. Yes, we actually kill the Boche, unlike you army boys," St. Jude said. "How many Boche did you kill, St. Jude?" "It were so darn many that I lost count," Catfish said with some lash on his tongue. St. Jude turned sour, grabbed the rest of the wine, and sulked to the back of the barn to finish it off. "So how did you get here?" Catfish asked Patrice. "I was on the run for almost a week, trying to get back to my village. When I did, my mother told me that the Boche were rounding up all the young men. She gave me a little food and money and told me to run away. So I ran as far as I could until I found this farmhouse, or what was left of it." Catfish put his hands on Patrice's shoulder. "Well, if you want to risk getting your neck stretched, you can join up with us." Patrice appraised the old cowboy and the cafe garçon. St. Jude had passed out in the corner of the barn. They weren't heroes, that much was sure. But neither was Patrice. So the young man agreed. "What should we do now?" Patrice said. "Well, I don't know about you two," Catfish said, "but I think St. Jude has the right idea." After a cool drink of well water and a nap, the new crew roused up to the growling of their bellies. Patrice lounged on the hay, his head still filled with cotton, while St. Jude went through the bombed-out farmhouse to see if they could scrounge anything. Catfish had already found a great treasure himself, a piece of rope. It was broken in and had a good taut to it. He made a lasso and attempted to throw it at a fence post. It had been a long time since he had used a rope. In Paris, the only time he used one was for the crowds at the universities, who were easy to please with simple rope tricks. There hadn't been any need for practical roping in some years. His first try at the post, Catfish missed. He looked around, hoping no one was looking. Jean had taken a spot near the barn where he could watch Catfish, to see if he could pick up any tips on being an outlaw. He had always assumed that his older brother was an extraordinary bandit from all the bragging, but after watching him in action, he thought St. Jude a poor model. The old cowboy, on the other hand, had gotten in and out of trouble with great skill, and he was now playing around with a rope. To what purpose, Jean couldn't guess. Catfish dragged the rope back in. Just working out the kinks in my throwing arm. He took aim and threw the rope at the post again, this time snagging it with the lasso. Why are you playing around with a fuzzy piece of rope? Jean asked. There's more to being an outlaw than shooting a gun. I learned to rope before I learned to walk. It's a skill quick to learn and a lifetime to master. Catfish motioned for Jean to join him, and he began to teach the boy the ways of the rope, Wild West style. This here is called a hondo, Catfish said, pointing at the end where he made a loop. Lucky for us, this rope is broke in. I always hated breaking in a new stiff rope, worse than breaking a bronco. Catfish coiled the rope and made another throw. The rope sailed through the air. The giant loop dropped over the post and with a quick pull fastened itself snugly against the wood. Now you try. Catfish handed the rope to Jean, who took it like a loaded gun. His first try didn't fill the bucket, but Catfish was patient, and soon the boy was getting the hang of it. Saint Jude came back from pilfering the bombed-out farmhouse, fingering a pocket watch. I know exactly where these country bumpkins stash their good stuff, Saint Jude said. Jean threw the rope at the post, this time snagging it. Patrice had taken the cotton out of his head and watched Catfish and Jean. Hey, he said, that's a pretty neat trick. Bah, Saint Jude said. You might as well play with your prick for all the good a mangy piece of rope is going to do you. In this line of work, you better know how to manage a sturdy piece of hemp, Catfish said. I don't see how throwing string around is going to help me get rich, Saint Jude replied. It won't get you rich unless you can rope money, and only a few fellas I knew of could do that. What I'm talking about is when they slip the noose over your neck. Catfish took the rope from Jean and began to make a hangman's knot from one end. Now, if you're a good roper and know how hemp reacts to pressure and movement, you might be able to wiggle out of the noose. Catfish held up the hangman's knot for all to see. St. Jude said, That's the stupidest thing I've heard come out of your old mouth. It's true, Catfish said. There was a feller by the name of Flour Sack Jones who I used to ride with in Utah and was one hell of a roper. Why, he could rope a cloud, squeeze it tight, and make it rain. One time the posse caught up with Flour Sack and decided to give him a bad case of hemp fever. Flour Sack, being an ace roper, didn't worry none about having the noose thrown around his neck. In fact, he said the knots were just right and the sons of bitches should be proud of doing a good job. That comment didn't go over well with the posse, so they slapped the horse. Flour Sack squeezed the horse's flanks and wiggled his head until the noose slipped right over it. The posse was so stunned it took them 5 minutes before they realized Flour Sack got away. Of course, the rope moved so fast over his head it rubbed all his skin off of his face. He had to go around the rest of his life with a flour sack over his head with 2 eye holes and another for his mouth. He wasn't pretty, and it took more money than usual to poke the horse, but he was alive, and his pecker still worked. Patrice and Jean laughed so hard they had to sit down. Even St. Jude let a chuckle get away from him. Was that a true story, Jean said. It is if you want it to be. Catfish undid the hangman's knot. A couple of goats walked past, stopping every now and then to nibble at the grass. Catfish smiled and handed Jean the rope. All right, now that you've been able to rope a wild fence post, let's see how well you do with a goat. Why can't we just shoot it? I ain't going to waste a bullet on a goat. A bear, maybe, but not a goat. Besides, the shot might be heard, and we're wanted men. Jean began to stalk the goats. He found that if he got too close, they would trot away. Soon, he got the feeling for how close he could get and coiled the rope for a throw. The closest one was a tame nanny that seemed content to graze and watch the proceedings. Jean crept around to the nanny's blind spot and made a throw. The nanny saw the rope coming from the corner of its eyes and made a run for it. Jean panicked and tried to pull the rope back, but instead of flying back towards him, the loop turned over on itself and made a lazy figure eight. The top part of the loop snagged the nanny's head, while the bottom half wrapped around its hind legs. Catfish for once was speechless. The boy had thrown a mangana de cabra, a trick throw usually used mostly on calves. The goat got up and tried to run. The rope flew out of Jean's hand, giving him a slight rope burn. Catfish caught the fleeing end of the rope, brought the goat down with a quick jerk, and hog-tied it. Jean ran towards it, feeling that he had almost allowed their hard-earned meal to escape. Catfish dragged the kicking and bleeding nanny towards a small ditch and cut its throat with his bowie knife. "You're a natural-born roper, son," Catfish said while the goat bled out. "Best I've seen since I came to France." Jean blushed. "I must admit I didn't know what I was doing." "Now, don't say that. You did it on purpose just to show me up. Ain't nothing wrong with a little bit of sugar to go with a story," Catfish said with a wink. Jean smiled. "I only said I didn't know what I was doing to let you know that you were not the only cowboy in France, mon ami." Catfish slapped his knee and let out a laugh louder than a church bell. "Well, cowboy, you can have the honor of hauling this goat carcass back to the barn. A stout feller like you shouldn't have any trouble." Jean arrived back at the barn with the goat over his shoulders like a sack of potatoes and so much blood covering his shirt it looked like he'd been butchered. "My God," Saint Jude said, "if Mother could see you now, she would beat you instead of me for a change." Jean flopped the dead goat onto a bale of hay and fell next to it. "Well, that was a great display of brawn," Catfish said. "Of course, I would have used the wheelbarrow over in the corner." Everyone had a laugh at Jean's expense. Catfish cut the choice meats from the carcass while Patrice started a fire. "Ugh," St. Jude said. "Don't tell me we're going to eat that foul creature." "You should have killed a lamb," Patrice said. "In fact, there were plenty of sheep running loose after the bombs blew up the pens. It was just their luck that they ran across the goats." "You boys sure are picky eaters for men on the run," Catfish said. "Why, I remember being chased all the way down to old Mexico dining on nothing but cactus leaves and rattlesnake. And I was lucky to get them victuals." "I've starved plenty of times, but I never would sink so low as to eat a sewer rat," St. Jude said. "Well, I guess you haven't starved," Catfish replied. "What does rattlesnake taste like?" Patrice asked. "A lot like sewer rat," St. Jude huffed, but he was hungry. He regretted eating so much of the bread and cured meats as his stomach was bigger than Jean's harvest sack. He was especially sad that they had no wine, just well water and apples. After the rude meal, the men decided to get some sleep. It had been a long, rough day, and fatigue quickly overtook them. Catfish took the first watch, as the long French summer day made way for a short, star-filled night. The old cowboy used the rest of the well water to soak his blistered feet. His joints were stiff as a dead man in the ground, and his back felt as if it were made of knotted pine. The aches and sores reminded Catfish of his youthful days on the outlaw trail. Across endless prairies under a timeless sky, rustling cattle and horses was a rough way to make a dishonest dollar. weeks in the saddle, day and night through rain, snow, heat, and thirst. The one thing that kept Catfish going was his pards. Men who formed lifelong friendships with just a chance meeting. Men like Butch Cassidy, Professor Brown, Don Chaps, Mike Cash, Lee English, and dozens of other cowboys. Most of that breed was gone now. Catfish had seen many a pard meet his fate, but Lee had been the hardest loss. During the Battle of Bellawood, Catfish and Lee were sent out to scout ahead in the thick forest, but the two got stuck behind enemy lines and Lee took a bullet. Catfish promised to come back with help, but when the Marines finally broke through, Lee wasn't where he left him. Catfish searched for days around the scorched and upturned earth, even put a hot blade to a captured German officer to make him tell what happened to his pard. But it was no use. No one knew the fate of Lee English, and not knowing was the worst thing Catfish ever faced. Bombers droned overhead, flying back from their attempt to bomb the British into submission. Catfish watched the sky, remembered taking Lee's hands as he promised to return. Then he thought of Hiccup, and his shoulders sagged. There was another man he let down, and a new burden to bear. Hiccup wasn't Catfish's oldest pard, but he was by far the dearest. Someone in the French High Command thought it was a joke to assign a stuttering officer to a pair of saddle-tramped cowboys in General Pershing's headquarters, making Catfish, Lee, and Hiccup the most peculiar crew ever to ride for the Allied cause. Then Lee was gone. By the time the armistice came and went, Catfish was back in America. Hiccup did his best to talk Catfish into staying, but the war took his best pard from the old days, and as long as he was in France, a part of Catfish would still be looking for Lee's Slewfoot track. Lucky for Catfish, Hiccup never gave up on him, and when he learned that Catfish was thrown into a Texas jail, Hiccup wrote to everyone he could think of. Blackjack Pershing got more than a few letters. Catfish thought his French pard was wasting his time, but one day the warden unlocked the door of his cell and let him go. Catfish took the next steamer to Paris, where Hiccup waited at the docks of Le Havre, waving his arms in the air. Now that man who went more than a fair distance for Catfish was paying the consequences for the old cowboy's decision. Catfish couldn't shake the feeling that he never did right by his pards. It was a feeling he could live with, but didn't want to die still having it. Catfish heard a stirring and glanced at the sleeping men. Jean rolled on his side, coughed, and sat up. The boy shook his head, then walked over and sat down next to Catfish. The old cowboy didn't move or speak. He stared into the stardust night and wondered how long it would be before he let Jean down too. "Do you think she's okay?" Jean whispered. Catfish didn't say anything. So Jean added, "Moo?" Catfish turned. "I'm sure she's all right." With those words, Jean's guilt poured out. "What kind of man am I?" he said. "How could I have left Moo to the Boche?" Jean looked at Catfish for an answer, but only saw the old cowboy's drooping mustache. "Did you leave anyone behind?" he asked. The old cowboy made a low sound Jean couldn't quite make out, but it sounded like a name. Catfish put an arm around Jean and held the boy tight. "The thing about friends and lovers is that no matter how much you love and care for them, you're bound to disappoint them. By the time you're my age, You'll have done and said things you never thought you could do to another human being, let alone a friend. But it's not too late, Jean said. Not for Moo, anyway. Who will take care of her? I'm sure Moo's a tough gal. She survived before you. She'll survive without, at least for now. At this moment, you have to think about surviving yourself. But how can I survive without her? Jean thought. He lifted his head to the night sky, seeing if he could find any answers in the thousands of stars. Son, Catfish said, the Creator, in his infinite wisdom, has given you two things freely, a time to live and a place to die. You can ask for more, but there's a price to pay. Did you have to pay it? Catfish took his arm off Jean and pulled out the silver flask of Kentucky amber.
Howdy and welcome back to the Strange West podcast. This is your host and word hustler extraordinaire, Trent Tano. And that was Chapter 5 of Paris High Noon, read by the talented James K. Doyle. And if you want to find out what happens next, you can either tune in to the Strange West podcast next week, or head on over to parishighnoon.com to get your very own copy. Both paperback and ebook available at parishighnoon.com. And if you want to look like a cowboy gunning down a Nazi, you can get a Paris High Noon t-shirt at society6.com/Trentano. Both Paris High Noon and mustache t-shirts in all different varieties are available at society6.com/Trentano. And once again, leading us out with their rendition of Eno Morricone's For a Few Dollars More is the Mighty Mitch Polzak and the Royal Deuces. Please visit them at mitchpolzak.com. That's Mitch, Polzak.com. Once again, this is Trent Tano wishing you happy trails, and we'll see you next time.